I'm Mel.
And I'm Mark.
And this is the Cerebral Sports Podcast. On the Cerebral Sports Podcast, we champion the mental development, wellness, and health of athletes, big, small, professional, and amateur.
Week to week, we'll have compelling conversations with athletes, coaches, parents, and mental health professionals to discuss their experiences and point of views as we work to bring awareness to the most vital muscle in an athlete's body, the mind.
Hello and welcome, everybody. I would like to introduce our guest today, Dr. Lally from Lock Haven University. She is a very, very vital piece to the campus. She's actually someone that I had studied under. She has a lot of things that she has done over her career, developing the sports and exercise science psychology for Lock Haven University. She has a lot of things that she did within the research of sports psychology. We refer to her as a sports psychologist consultant. She has developed other programs within the exercise science as well. And she is a friend, a mentor, and someone that I definitely am very excited to sit down with today and go over a few things within sports psychology. Welcome, Dr. Lally.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Marlon, how are you doing today?
I'm well. That's a beautiful intro. Outstanding accomplishments. I want to applaud you. It's great to be in your presence and to meet someone of your stature. Sports has always been a big part of my life, and in lock and step with the body goes the mind. So kudos to you. And we hope to unearth some things today that people can kind of take with them and learn on, and maybe dispel some myths, some stigmas, and grow and just be better as a society.
I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you. And Dr. Lally, my introduction was really a small microcosm of everything that you have done. Is there anything that I may have missed that you would like to highlight before we begin?
Maybe just for the athletes and coaches and parents who might be listening, that I do have a couple of different roles. So one is as a professor at the university. So I teach undergraduate and graduate students in sport and exercise psychology. But I also have a private practice where I work with athletes from all levels. So I've worked with younger athletes, high school athletes, college athletes, and some professional athletes. So I do have kind of the theory that you see in the classroom, as well as about 20 years of practical experience.
Awesome. Thank you. I mean, it's going to be, like I said, this interview is one that I'm looking so forward to. First thing I would like to talk about is, what is sports psychology? What exactly is it, and where did it start?
So that's great place to start. It is sports psychology is really interested in two different things. It's interested in the impact of our psychology on our sport performance. So I know you both have a sport background. So think about times when you've been really excited about a game, really felt ready to play, felt ready to face the opponent, and how that may have impacted your performance. So maybe that was one of your best games ever, for example. But then think about a time where you may have been nervous beforehand or didn't feel ready. Maybe you'd heard a lot about the other team and were anticipating being a little outmatched. And so maybe your performance wasn't as great as it could have been. So sports psychology is interested in part on the impact of our psychology on our performance. But it's also interested in the reverse relationship. So how does our performance impact our psychology? So think of that best game ever or that best play ever and how you felt afterwards. So, the pride, the satisfaction, the celebration with the teammates. So how does our performance impact how we're feeling? And then in both cases, then how does that impact our behavior? So are we really going after it in practice, the next practice we see? Are we kind of like, oh, I'm not sure about practice today after that terrible loss on the week? So it looks at how those experiences impact our behavior in a sports setting.
Very good. Thank you. And when did you decide, what made you decide to get into sports psychology?
That's okay. That's going back a ways. So I actually have an undergrad degree in psychology. And I did in my last year a clinical placement. So I had intended actually to go into clinical psychology, and I did a placement. I think I worked on Fridays for the whole year, in a lockdown unit for adults who were they had physical, but mostly cognitive disabilities, and they were in a lockdown unit because they were injurious to themselves or injurious to others. And the population was fine, but what I really noticed was that the psychologists I was working with were really burned out. And I thought, the advice they gave me was that I needed to be less empathetic. And I thought, geez, I don't know if I wanted a career where I had to be less empathetic to the people I was working with and the clients I was going to see. And but I also really noticed that it was very much of a medical model approach, and of course, because I was in a medical setting, but it was very much, diagnose a disorder, treat it with medication, and see what happens. And I thought, I don't know if that's what I really wanted to do. And I had planned to take a year off after my undergrad to work and then travel and then go back to grad school. And in the meantime, I talked to someone at work whose son was doing sports psychology. So really, a great chance conversation. And I was like, wait, what is that? And I realized a way for me to combine two things that I really love. So psychology and sport. And I said, this might be a better fit for my training and for my philosophy as well. So, and then I went to grad school and here I am.
Wow. That is an absolute amazing story and explanation. And to the people listening, student athletes, parents, it is always okay to pivot mid-study. It is always okay to pivot if you don't have the passion or you see something in what you thought you wanted to do that you don't necessarily like. I know I did. So that's a beautiful thing. So kudos to you for your flexibility. With that said, you mentioned the two things that you love. You mentioned sport. So did you play sports growing up? And if you did, what was the highest level you competed at? What was your sport of choice? I'd love to know a bit about that.
Okay, so I actually grew up in a hockey family. So I don't know if anyone's detected the accent yet. So I'm Canadian. And so I grew up in a hockey family. And at the time I was growing up, girls could play hockey, but it really was not a thing. Girls played this other sport, a Canadian sport that I know a lot of the students I've worked with here have never heard of, but it's called ringette. So I played volleyball in high school, and I also ran cross country. And that's as high as I went with regards to competitive sport. I still run, and I'm a pretty regular runner. So I'm now a marathon distance runner. So I started that in high school and still do it. I think it is important. So some people ask, like, why are you still running so much? So I probably run 5 or 6 days a week. And I do think there's part of it of having that lived experience when you're talking to athletes, even though it's definitely not the same sport. It's definitely not at the same competitive level that they're at. But there is part of that appreciation, at least a little bit of what they might be going through on a day-to-day basis. So so the highest level was high school, although I'm still running today.
Wow. Wow. So have you done any full marathons, half marathons?
Yeah, no, I've done I think 12 marathons. Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
I
That
know.
is, yeah,
I
you
know.
you can't say that the highest level you competed at is high school. That's actually, you're not
That's
giving
it.
yourself enough credit
Yeah,
because
yeah. I mean, that's a really good question. Like, is it if you're competing against yourself and competing against time and the impact of age, is it still competition? But yeah, so it is definitely a way to relieve stress, and it gives me a really good opportunity to think about things. And as we're on a podcast, I often listen to podcasts, so I don't have a lot of time to read as much as I used to. So I listen to a lot of podcasts that I kind of still learn about science and developments and stuff. So it's a good time to use my brain and my body, I guess.
absolutely, absolutely. I was going to ask you, how do you believe sports psychology can help athletes? But I kind of want to pivot that question a bit. How does your purview on psychology help you in, your marathon running, running a marathon? Full disclosure, I think the longest I've ever run in one bit is probably 6 miles. And I don't know what happened that morning where I felt like, I'm going to do this today. And I did it, and I haven't done it since. And that was probably in 2016. Long distance running, people who run long distances, I have a different level of respect for them. I feel like you're able to put your mind in a different place and space. Jamel and I used to be on the football team, and we would see the cross country runners. We'd be at football practice, see the cross country runners running through the trails, and I'm
Uh-huh.
just like, how do you know music? No, you're just going. Like, how, what does your purview on psychology? What advantages does it give you to be able to do something like that?
Well, I would say I have respect for football players who put themselves, up against someone else, and that they know that they're going to be hit, or there's a possibility. So I think it's just a different type of activity. I do feel very lucky that I have found something that I really like, that I still really like at this age. So people are always saying, well, you should try this and you should try that, and I'm like, ooh, but I'd have to give up my run to do that, and I don't want to. But I definitely have applied the sports psychology principles I talk to athletes about when I'm running. So it definitely at if you get so my father-in-law, who ran a lot of marathons, he told me at one time, you just have to get to 20, and then that's where the marathon starts. So you got to get to 20, and then it starts at 20. Can you do the last 6? And so it's really during that last 6 that I really have to use my mental skills. I listen to music. I listen to podcasts. I plan to think about certain things while I'm running. I've had marathons where I say, okay, 21 to 22, I'm going to think. I have 3 daughters, so I'm going to think about this daughter during that mile, and then the next mile I'm going to think about my other daughter. So and just spend that time committed to thinking about the fun that we've had together and stuff. So there's definitely mental strategies that go into it. But I think that's true of every sport and activity that people are pursuing. So I don't think I'm special. I think but the running is a lot of people are like, why it's not fun. I get it.
I mean, you said when you get to mile 20, like if mile 20 was just so easy to get to, I mean, it's a hard thing to get to. And God
Yeah.
bless you and 3 kids who are helping you get through these runs.
Yeah, when I heard that, I was like, what? But I started at mile 0. Don't the first 20 count? And he was basically like,
nope.
No, not really. It's can you get to 20, and then the hard work starts. So I was like, oh, but I've had time to get used to that phrase and concept. So he told it to me a long time ago.
Gotcha. So you definitely apply some of the mental practices, some mental prep, some imagery, and some thoughts as you're going through your mileage.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I have one other thing. Like I was working with a few schools early on after graduating, and when you're working with schools, just like I know you're doing within your private practice, what is the perception of sports psychology with coaches? Are they acceptant to it, or are they a little bit more resistant? Are there some coaches on the staff that may be into it, and there are other ones that are kind of standoffish? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I would say that in my experience, that's changed over the years. I would say that coaches are, I would say today, really open to the concept of mental training, and I would say have been for a while. If I look at the field as a whole, I would say early on there was very much an approach of, we have a problem, an athlete's having a problem, so we need to bring someone in to help. And I think we still see that reactive response in that an athlete who is projected to play really well or perform really well underperforms. And so they maybe think, well, maybe there's something mental going on. They're not motivated. Maybe it's a pre-competition anxiety concern. And so they're definitely responding to something. But I also think that a lot of athletes, coaches, I'm going to extend that group to parents as well, that they're really looking at sports psychology as an additional tool, and that they're being very proactive. And so one of the things I talk to athletes about when I get that kind of a little bit shy about the mental training side from athletes is I explain that, you've just reached a level where the mental side is really important. So, when the athletes are young, it's about getting accustomed to the sport, and do they like this sport? And it should still be largely about having fun. And then when they progress, it does become more competitive and more serious. And so when they're not doing as well, they think, oh, something's wrong. And I'm always like, no, nothing's wrong. It's just that at this level now, the mental side is more important. And you've been focusing all your training on the physical side. It just means that now you have to take the mental side into account. And I think coaches are largely the same, that when they're working at a higher level, that there's just a huge mental component. And most of the coaches I've met want to use all the resources and tools available to them, whether it's their athletic training, their strength and conditioning, sports psychology, nutrition. They're looking for all the resources available to them to help their athletes perform best. So I think they're fairly open and receptive, and a lot of them come with ideas of their own. A lot of them were athletes, so they can speak about the mental side of their experience. So yeah, it's been really great in terms of that transition over a long period of time.
Yeah. So do you feel like society as well as a whole is starting to be a little bit more acceptance as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So I think that there's a lot of attention on athletes right now. Well, there has always been, but I think what we've seen in the last maybe 5 or 10 years has been a greater emphasis on athletes' mental health. And if we take a second to distinguish between their mental health and their mental performance, those are two different things. So I think we've seen a lot of athletes struggle with mental health issues, and that's caused a lot of attention on mental health and mental performance and the overlap between the two. So I do think that we look at a greater sort of need among athletes to look at both the mental health side and the mental performance side. And so we see, I think, sports psychology continuing to grow in that regard.
Yeah. Awesome. I agree.
Amazing. There obviously has been a tremendous event and change in our society over the last 2, 3 years now with COVID-19 and the whole pandemic. What impact do you think that's had or that has had on athletes, student athletes? What do you think?
Oh my gosh. Terrible, I think, terrible. Probably like all of us. So, changes to family dynamics and work environments and school environments. I think one of the things that we see, particularly among younger athletes, but I think this is true of athletes who are older and still competing, is that sport becomes so central to their lives. And you guys can probably look back on your own experiences, and it becomes so defining in terms of who a person is. So I think one of the impacts has been, particularly when activities were canceled, that really had an impact on athletes in terms of, well, wait, who am I if my sport is not available right now? What am I supposed to do with my time? And I think that was probably even more difficult for athletes who were at the end of or near the end of their careers. So that last year, the last 2 years, they kind of lost. And so that transition out of sport happened very abruptly for them. But I also think, I don't know, I mean, I really believe in the power of sport to impact our lives, and to be a really good way for athletes to learn important life skills, including coping skills. So while I think they lost that sport experience and identity part of themselves, they also lost the opportunity to learn some of those coping skills. So how do I interact with my teammate? How do I interact and respond to my coach when my coach is telling me something I don't want to hear? Because I might need to do that if it's in an education setting and a professor is telling me something I don't want to hear, or my boss is telling me something I don't want to hear. And so I think they lost some of that ability to develop those coping skills. And it's such a good way to relieve stress. I think while there was a tremendous amount of stress caused by COVID, it also eliminated one of the ways in which we manage our stress. So I'm trying to
Wow.
find the silver lining. I don't
Yeah.
think I found the silver lining yet, other than a lot of sports and activities are back. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm noticing a common thread and theme with the things that you're saying about, athletes, student athletes, and things like that. And it's very applicable to the everyday person and everyday life. And I believe that if people start to look at sports psychology like that and with that mindset, it would be even more accepted and more applied to more and more athletes, parents, and coaches. Taking different approaches to make sure that the students' minds are being developed, athletes' minds are being developed as well as their bodies. So I want to call that out because I can relate to the change in the change in your cadence as an athlete that COVID caused. I was a person that used to wake up every day, go to the gym, then go to work. And then when your routine is broken, you don't necessarily realize why you're more grumpy, you're perhaps more aloof, not as focused, and it's because you don't have sport, you don't have the activity that you once had. You're sedentary, something that you linked yourself to and your identity to is no longer there. So great call out, and I totally agree with what you're saying.
Yeah.
Totally agree. Something that you mentioned earlier was about being proactive. Now, in the news, there have been some unfortunate occurrences where some top student athletes have taken their lives in the NCAA. And do you feel that sports psychology should be something that should be like somewhat of a preemptive um, a preemptive strategy for student athletes and athletes, or something that should be looked at as kind of like a go as needed, or you know
Yeah,
in
that's a
that
good, that's a
particular.
really good question. So, I actually have, okay, so I have a grad student who a few years ago, as an assignment, looked at all of the D1 programs and where sports psychology services were available in those D1 programs. And then so it was a few years old, so I had a student just recently revise that. And so there are actually quite a few sports psychology consultants working in D1 programs. Now, I think that's true of D2 and D3. We just didn't have that assignment. So I do think that the services should be available to student athletes, as well as counseling services, which are available on all campuses. But then you raise a question of whether or not it should be mandatory, and that's tricky. One of the kind of ethical principles within sports psychology is an individual's right to self-determination. So they should be able to decide if they want the services. So, and I'll give it to you in a different context. Let's say you have a coach who says, I'm going to bring in a sports psychology consultant and we're going to talk about focusing and concentration. And you have an athlete who says, I don't want to participate in that for whatever reason. I talked to someone else about that, or I like my focus and concentration is really great. Or in fact, I'm so focused that I know I've got to go and do my schoolwork. Like I need to get that done. I don't have time for an extra meeting. That they should have the right to say, I don't want to participate in that. And that sports psychology would argue we can't force someone to do it. So ethically, can we force them? No. Should it be available? Absolutely. Both on the sports psychology side, and on the mental health side. And what we're seeing a lot is overlap between the two, where we are seeing sports psychology consultants talking about the application of all of these skills to other settings. So I'll give you an example. When I work with an athlete, particularly a younger, if it's an older athlete and they've sort of developmentally, they've got all those life skills already. But if I'm talking with a younger athlete, we talk about, these are skills that we're going to talk about in terms of application to your sport. But that's a really short shelf life, really. I mean, in the grand scheme of life, your competitive career is going to be relatively short. So if we talk about it only in the context of your high school sport or your college sport, we're really shortchanging its ability to really be applied in other settings right now, but also in the future. So if we talk about pre-competition anxiety, say that's one of the things that they're working through, I'll talk about, well, how are you in class when you have to do a class presentation? Oh no, same thing. I talk really fast. My mouth gets dry. I can't speak in front of a group. Well, wait a minute. So we've been talking about how do you develop a really good pre-performance routine to apply before a game. Let's talk about how we would adapt that to a classroom setting when you've got to go and do a presentation. Or let's talk about, wait, you have to go and talk to your teacher about something, and like talking to your coach gets you a little bit nervous. Let's talk about, well, how do you apply those same skills to going to talk to your teacher? Or in the future, how that applies to talking to someone who's interviewing you for a job. So for sure, I think that the services should be available on both sides. And then there should be discussion about how it's valuable in sport, but also other settings.
Mel, I'm going to hand off to you in a second. I just wanted to, I'll be remiss to not ask this question as a follow-up. You mentioned, the shelf life, you mentioned the age. Do you think there's a sweet spot age-wise when student athletes should, perhaps start, you know, looking into sports psychology, or parents or coaches should say, hey, let's bring Dr. Lally in to talk to our team and our players?
I think as young as possible, but I might kind of frame it in a different way. I work with some athletes who are really young, so 6, 7, 8. And so I work with a gymnastics club. And so I'll work with them from 6 to 18, basically. And sometimes we'll have a topic that we talk about. So the coaches might say, yeah, can you bring Trisha to talk about dealing with pre-competition stress? We're getting into meet season. So how you talk about that with a 6-year-old is really different than how you're going to talk to an 18-year-old about it. But I think one of the other ways that sports psychology can really have an impact is in the way in which sport is delivered. So when you see really young kids at 6, 7, 8 in like really competitive sport, and they're already crying after practices and they don't want to go back, and you think, wait a minute, is this the way that sport should be delivered if it's supposed to be fun? And again, over the long course of a lifespan, you want kids to get involved in sport and physical activity at a young age so they can continue, into their older age. So if they're at, they start so early, it's really competitive, then 10, 12, they're dropping out, we're kind of missing the bigger picture there. So I also think sports psychology has an application not only in terms of the performance side, but also in terms of how sport is delivered, how it's organized, and then that extends to training for coaches and parents and officials. So I think it has a really broad application in terms of sport and physical activity and movement for everyone.
Amazing.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask that too, as far as like from the
like
age,
mine.
what time, what year did you feel it would be good, and how long, But even with that, like as you were talking about the younger ages, right? And then once they get into the professional setting, right, and they become professional athletes, and we see a lot of it now as well, where athletes are just sitting out. They're saying they need a mental break, they need a timeout, they need to kind of reflect, they need to be able to kind of reset themselves mentally. And I wanted to know what your thoughts were on that. Like, do you think it's something that's important? And how do you feel the media as a whole is kind of taking into it? What your take is on all of those different things that we see?
Yeah. So one of the things we know with the literature on burnout is that most, and I'm fairly comfortable saying this, but we'd have to go back to the research to get the exact number and reference. But I think the research would tell you that I think it's between 65 and 75% of high-level athletes defined as college and beyond will experience burnout every season. So at some point. So I think that's a fairly common experience where athletes will feel like I need to take a break. And I think that's symptomatic not only of the highest levels of sport, but sport in general in the US. So when we look at youth sport, it is so competitive at that level, and athletes are spending so much time traveling, so much time in practice, so much time in the same sport all year, so that year-round training. A lot of coaches will say they really love multi-sport athletes as long as the other sport doesn't interfere with their sport. I can see you guys smiling. You've seen that experience, right? So I think we see that year-round training in a single sport, even at the really young ages. And so the fact that 5, 10, 15, by the time they're in the pros, that they need to take a break, it's not surprising. I think if they're saying that they need to take a break, they've probably missed some signs before that the pressure was too much. And I don't mean too much for the athlete to handle. I think athletes are phenomenal and the things that they handle. I mean, the pressure that's being placed on them is too much, and that we should remove the pressure rather than necessarily remove the athlete. So I think the media, I mean, I'm not a media expert. I think, there's probably always stories that draw attention. It may be because particularly sports media, like to be a professional athlete, is something that a lot of people aspire to. I remember my kids going to visit them at school one day, and the kids had to draw their face and then put with their career. I don't know if you guys ever did that when you were young. At 5 or 6, what did you want to be when you grew up? And of the 20 sort of self-portraits I walked by in the hallway, I know 18 might have said they wanted to be an Olympic gold medalist swimmer, and I was like, wow, until I realized that one of their teachers was a former Olympic gold medalist swimmer, you know? So, but from a very young age, a lot of people want to aspire to being a professional athlete. So an athlete at the highest level, if it's Olympic level or professional. So maybe it's hard for people to understand, like, why would you ever want to leave that? So maybe that's the lens they're looking at the scenario from. But there's probably so much that we don't know about the individual circumstance that it's kind of hard to comment on each one. But
Yeah, and I feel like the media too. It's like, especially athletes, that when you hit that pinnacle of being the superstar, right? They can't show any chink in armor. They shouldn't be able to have a time to even take a nap. Like they're magical creatures that we look at. So when they do experience something that's more mental, not so much physical, it's a little bit harder for us as people that are looking to digest. That's the take that I see sometimes.
yeah.
But I
Well,
am.
you guys are both former football players. I mean, I would
Yes.
think that football would be one of those sports in particular where you see that
Yeah.
no chink in the armor.
But I
Yeah.
remember saying when I played college ball, and some days where it was like you felt great, you go out there, and I'm like, how do these professional athletes? They're like robots. Like, you got to be tired, you got to be fatigued, you got to have like these mental different things that go on, but yet they can continue to perform at this high level and do it so well. So that's one of the things that really sparked my interest in getting involved and learning more about it, was just trying to fully understand the athlete all the way through. So.
Yeah.
Amazing. Something that I know Jamel and myself, we both went through this as college athletes, is somewhat of like, the ridicule, some of the unkind adjectives that you may get called at practice to motivate you and things like that. Jamel's laughing because he remembers, right? And I think that those things, you're soft, you're not tough, things like that, those things bleed into society and it creates a stigma. If you could address the stigma that kind of hangs over sports psychology, kind of hangs over developing the mind and athletes saying, hey, I need a mental break, or I need to go and see and talk to someone. If you could speak to society, what would you say? Like, what if you could send a message out, or a response to that notion? What would you say?
Well, I mean, one thing I would say is that I think that stigma has changed over the years. So I think people are more open to the sports psychology side of sport, to the mental training side. I think with regards to the mental health side, so when we talk about mental health, we talk about mental health issues. I think that is really more at the forefront in the last, I think you used earlier 2 or 3 years. And I would agree. I mean, we've seen athletes, high profile athletes, receive more attention. I mean, I think I would say, I mean, at the core, they're still regular people. So one of the terms I've heard some athletes use, and I don't know if you've heard it before, but sometimes they want to be a NARP, which is a non-athlete regular person. Have you guys are familiar with that? And so I do think there is a different experience when you're an athlete, a student athlete, a professional athlete. But at the core, you're still a person. And while the sport experience, hopefully, when done well, is making you stronger in terms of communication skills and leadership skills, I don't know that that's always the case. So yeah, and instead of a stigma, how about some more support? I think I would say.
Absolutely. I
Yeah,
love that.
yeah,
I agree to that 100%.
yeah,
Dr. You know, I really value you as a person, and I think that's evident. Like I said, you were one of the biggest influences when it came to me learning about sports psychology. Our goal here with this podcast, or video cast, I think that's what it's called now, because it's not just video cast, is to really shed light and educate and have people learn more about the importance of the mental half of competition. And if we can get to the point where it can cross over to regular day activity and regular day life, and the mental side of mental health, I think it would be a mission accomplished. This is our first podcast, right? And as I said, Mara and I, we sat back and we were very excited about the idea of it, but I felt like it was most important to kick it off with a good amount of structure and a good amount of information, so that way people who do tune in and watch, they can kind of understand a little bit more of the benefits of what it is that we're looking to try to shed light on. So I want to say thank you. I appreciate you, Mar. As always, it's anytime we hang out, if I'm not messing around, joking on you, and I could do some jokes now, but I won't. It's
Oh, I'd like to hear some of those.
I'm just gonna start off with the yellow hat. We're gonna go.
I love it. I love it.
Thank you. No, absolutely. This is great. And Jamel, thank you for putting this together. Jamel was waxing poetic about you for the longest. I've heard your name for years, so it was amazing to actually meet you today virtually, but it counts.
Thank you.
You are most impressive, and I understand Jamel's point of view on you and the impact you had on him, and the impact you continue to have, in the sports psychology arena. And I just want to say kudos to you. It all makes sense. It all adds up today.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for having me. I wish you the best of luck with this project.
Yeah, I just want to be able to give people that play the sports the same thing that I wish we would have had. Like if we would have been able to listen to something like this going into a camp or to a game, it would be great. So thank you.
Well, I will say one thing before we say goodbye is that athletes are amazing. I will talk to an athlete and I'll say, well, tell me what you do on the mental side. And they'll say, well, no, I don't do anything. I'm like, well, wait a minute. Like, tell me about your best game ever. What were you doing? Oh, I did this and then I did that. And I listened to music and I talked to my coach. And then I'm like, oh, so you did do something. And they're like, wait, does that count? And I'm like, yes, absolutely. So it's when we talk about the sports psychology, sometimes it's about, well, what do you do already that works? And maybe they're not doing it all the time. So it's not always teaching them. Sometimes it is teaching them something new. But sometimes it's about, well, you're already doing it. Let's just make sure you're doing it all the time, or sometimes at the right time. So, I mean, athletes are of all ages and all sports, just really amazing.
Yeah.
Well said. Well said.
All right. Well, thank you. Episode 1.